Mr. Speaker, the President of the United States.
In 1997, as President Bill Clinton began a second term, he paid a customary visit to Congress to deliver one of his most important policy speeches that year, his State of the Union message.
So tonight I issue a call to action. Action by this Congress, action by our states, by our people, to prepare America for the 21st century.
On that night, while every major television network provided live coverage, the men and women of Congress listened carefully. The president was signaling his priorities. Lawmakers would have to decide how they would respond.
We face no imminent threat, but we do have an enemy. The enemy of our time is inaction.
Working together might not be easy since once again the president, a Democrat, would face a Republican majority in Congress. During his first term, that majority challenged the president on everything from health care reform to troop deployment in Iraq. Republicans initiated investigations like Whitewater that questioned the president's integrity.
The spirit we bring to our work will make all the difference. We must be committed to the pursuit of opportunity for all Americans, responsibility from all Americans, in a community of all Americans.
As 1997 began, all sides were pledging cooperation. But within weeks, those good intentions would be tested as Congress revived a contentious fight over how to balance the budget. As the president and Congress went back to work in 1997, most agreed that years of government spending had gotten out of hand.
We here tonight have an historic opportunity. Let this Congress be the Congress that finally balances the budget.
The growing federal deficit now stood at more than $5 trillion. That's the amount of money the government had borrowed to continue operating. But because the government had not repaid the loans, it shouldered a huge debt.
It was very important politically for Congress and the president to work out a budget deal in 1997. What both the president and the Republican Congress discovered in 1996 was that if they acted together in a kind of responsible way, making small but sizable steps towards solving problems, people liked it. That's why they both got reelected.
86% of the American people want a balanced budget now. We don't think
most lawmakers agreed the federal government should have a balanced budget that would force Congress to spend no more than was collected. But there was no agreement on how that should be done.
We desperately want to bring real change to Washington, and we want to do it now.
I have told them that I will work with them, and I will work with them, and I believe we can do it.
For 30 years, Congresses have been trying to balance a budget, but it always got too hard.
House Republicans wanted to balance the budget by amending the United States Constitution. The president and many Democrats said that was going too far. They feared a constitution that required a balanced budget would limit Congress from borrowing money in times of crisis.
Balancing the budget requires only your vote and my signature. It does not require us to rewrite our Constitution. I believe it is both unnecessary and unwise to adopt a balanced budget amendment that could cripple our country in time of economic crisis and force unwanted results such as judges halting Social Security checks or increasing taxes.
The House had already passed the balanced budget amendment. Republicans, with the help of some Democrats, lacked only one vote to pass the amendment in the Senate and send it on to the states for ratification. The only senator who remained undecided was Robert Torricelli.
I believe there are enormous ramifications to this potential change.
Senator Torricelli, the question was, which party gets hurt if nothing happens? There's a deadlock.
When he was in the House, he had supported a balanced budget amendment. But he was a Democrat, and the president, the leader of his party, was now personally appealing for his help. Torricelli's vote would decide the issue.
I have no doubt that the president is a persuasive individual, and it made a difference with Senator Torricelli, who'd, after all, committed to supporting the amendment. But in the end, to be the person who actually is responsible for amending the Constitution, something that we have done very, very rarely, very serious business, is a heavy weight to bear.
The president talked privately with Torricelli. In Congress, the debate intensified.
We've gone from a bad strategy to another, a little less bad strategy.
I think it is important that we stand on principle.
When the Senate votes later today, 11 Democrats and 55 Republicans say they will vote in favor of the proposal, but that is still one vote shy of the majority needed to pass a constitutional amendment.
Mr. Thomas.
When the vote was finally called, the effort to balance the budget by changing the Constitution failed by a single vote.
Mr. Torricelli.
Torricelli's vote. He had voted against the amendment as the president had hoped. The president announced he would set up a committee to study some of the budget concerns Torricelli had raised.
I think understanding that this would not give us a balanced budget necessarily, there were many, many negative consequences that could easily flow from it, that Senator Torricelli didn't need a whole lot of pushing. He just needed a rationalization so that he could more easily explain why an earlier pledge was being changed. And of course, he had the rationalization. It was a different kind of amendment. There were some changes in the substance of it that gave him the fig leaf that he needed.
With the bid for a constitutional amendment defeated, Congress and the president nevertheless went on to pursue bipartisan efforts to balance the budget. By the end of the year, cooperation had succeeded where confrontation had failed in achieving the balanced budget that everyone wanted.
This budget marks the end of an era, an end to decades of deficits that have shackled our economy, paralyzed our politics, and held our people back.
The outcome of the balanced budget confrontation in 1997 may well have been affected by another budget battle that began just before Christmas in 1995.
They said they would not even continue to talk unless we agreed to make deep and unconscionable cuts in Medicare and Medicaid. That's unacceptable.
Don't ever think we aren't tough. We're just as tough as you are.
There comes a time when no deal is better than a bad deal.
The Speaker hasn't wanted to compromise. He wants it his way or not at all.
We want to balance the budget now.
Once again, they are threatening to shut the government down.
The weather on the Hill is frightful, and the budget cutting so spiteful. But the Republican Scrooges pose, let it close, let it close, let it close.
The shutdown was just that. It was going to be a shutdown. We became quite concerned about the shutdown because we had no idea, again, whether or not we would be paid.
On December 16, 1995, Dan Ehrer, like 280,000 federal employees, found himself out of work. The Republicans in Congress and President Bill Clinton had deadlocked when the president vetoed a Republican-backed budget.
They have sent me legislation that would give our children less clean drinking water, less safe food, dirtier air.
Money to fund federal offices had run out, and Congress was unwilling to pass a resolution that allowed short-term borrowing until a budget agreement could be reached.
Unless there's a balanced budget deal in 7 years using CBO numbers, we don't have much interest in passing a continuing resolution.
So, with Christmas less than 2 weeks away, Federal offices closed and employees like Arer went home. After more than 20 years of outstanding service with the Department of Health and Human Services, Arer and his family faced the holidays not knowing when the next paycheck would arrive.
The fact that we didn't know obviously created all sorts of mental stress. And I found myself here sitting down with my family and talking about how we could make this dollar stretch. And that dollar stretch, federal employees are not rich folks. We're paid a good livable wage, but we're certainly not rich folks. And so there's some planning in terms of what are we going to do if our finances, our funds are cut off for some period of time. And we went through that. We really did.
And of course, I'm concerned about the federal employees, those that aren't working, who want to work, and those who are working, who haven't gotten paid, who are going to run into some very serious financial problems with their mortgages and other things soon.
We need our money! We need our money!
The shutdown marked the second time in less than 2 weeks that a stalemate over the budget had disrupted federal government.
This being the day fixed by the 20th Amendment.
The problem was still the same. Republicans in Congress wanted the president to sign off on a balanced budget that cut programs like Medicare and Medicaid, which were dear to the president. Both sides held firm, and the president vetoed the Republican-backed budget again. But this time, the outcome was more dramatic. The earlier veto had resulted in the closing of national monuments, parks, and passport offices, which had been bad enough. But the public was not prepared for what took place in December. Now, government workers had been laid off without pay. As a series of emergency meetings took place on Capitol Hill, media across the country interviewed federal employees and their families about the effects of government gridlock.
It's very demoralizing, and it really makes me angry because we want to do the work.
This is the example we are sending out to the world.
I wish that the ones up there could act like 4 years old and take care of their business like they're supposed to be.
We've had other shutdowns. They tended to last for a day or two to be more symbolic. This turned into something more than symbolism. It takes a while for a shutdown to really cause some dislocation for people. This one did. It, of course, affected vacation plans because of national parks. It affected an awful lot of people on fixed incomes who were worried about getting the checks that the government sends out, Social Security or otherwise. It turns out that people who don't think often about what services government provides to them, they don't see them tangibly in front of their faces. Government actually does an awful lot of things that affect people's daily lives, and if you cut it off, it doesn't take very long before they see those things happening.
We want new tech! We want new tech!
It is wrong for the Congress to shut the government down, just to make a political point.
This administration cannot be trusted. They cannot keep their word. They cannot keep their promises.
There's nothing in the Constitution that says the president has to negotiate with the Congress or the government stops running.
The president shut down the government. You ought to ask him what he wants to do about it.
While some Republican hardliners insisted that the shutdown would force the president to compromise, Newt Gingrich worried more and more that his party was losing the public relations battle.
Federal employees ought to be back. All federal employees ought to be at work. That we know they want to be, and it's not fair.
Home with his family, waiting out the fight, Dan Arer became concerned about the people his agency served. Among them were mothers and children who relied on government funding for health care.
Some question came up about whether or not some of them would be funded timely, or whether they, in fact, would really run out of dollars and be unable to serve people out there in the field. Clearly, we all felt it was politics. It didn't have anything to do with our functions every day, which was simply to come to work and do our very best at what we did.
Blamed for the fiasco by many, congressional Republicans looked for a way out. On January 4th, 1996, they supported House Speaker Newt Gingrich as he provided a plan that allowed workers to return to their jobs with pay. 21 days after it had begun, the government shutdown, the longest in United States history, was over.
Well, it's good. Glad to be back. Glad it's over.
The passionate 104th Congress had engaged in pitched battle with the president and lost not only in the media, but in the legislative arena as well.
They thought they could bulldoze over the president with their unity and discipline, but failed to remember that with a veto, a president can, if he's determined, block most Congresses from doing most things, because all he needs to do is convince 1/3 plus one of the members of one of the two houses, and he can keep their actions from occurring. As long as a president has some discipline within his own party, if it's a minority party in Congress, he can basically have the leverage that he needs to bring at least the Republicans, in this case, to the table, to keep them from prevailing with whatever they want to do. The veto was the crucial power for Bill Clinton, and it's not something that he had to exercise all the time. It was the simple knowledge that it was there that made all the difference.
Congressional leaders did succeed in gaining a balanced budget commitment from the president, but the price had been high. In the fall of 1996, long after workers returned to their jobs, some incumbents lost elections. And in 1997, the GOP operated cautiously, allowing President Clinton to set the budget agenda before announcing a budget plan of their own.
The suffering sort of became a message. It was a message that when government shuts down, it's not a joke. It's something to be taken very seriously. And we saw that in the office, again, as sort of a continuation of the struggle between the president and Congress.
America must continue to be an unrelenting force for peace, from the Middle East to Haiti, from Northern Ireland to Africa. Taking reasonable risks for peace keeps us from being drawn into far more costly conflicts later.
Taking reasonable risks for peace. That was what President Bill Clinton said he was doing when he sent United States ground troops into Bosnia. In December 1995, the first 20,000 United States soldiers arrived in the war-torn country as part of a NATO peacekeeping force. Now, more than a year later, troops were still there, and the president wanted Congress to support their staying even longer.
Tonight, I ask Congress to continue its strong support of our troops. They are doing a remarkable job there for America, and America must do right by them.
But some in Congress still oppose troop commitment for Bosnia's civil conflict, which might drag on for years.
You can't run foreign policy like social work. You can't look for some good to do around the world.
And they wanted the president to consult Congress on the decision. Among them was Republican Kay Bailey Hutchison, a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee.
President, Congress has not been consulted. Congress has not authorized this deployment. It is not an emergency.
Members of Congress were very concerned that they were not consulted when the president made the commitment to put troops on the ground in Bosnia. And finally, eventually, Congress did get at least a consultation, but no one felt that it was done early enough and certainly with any intent to listen to Congress. And I think there are great misgivings in Congress right now about the Bosnia operation, about whether the underlying agreement at Dayton is even has a remote chance of success, and whether putting our troops in harm's way is the right thing to do when we don't have a policy that seems to have a chance for success, a timetable, and an exit strategy.
Senator Hutchison questioned whether the president was violating the spirit of a 1973 law designed to restrict presidential war-making powers. Congress passed that law, the War Powers Act, as a result of Presidents Johnson and Nixon directing secret or misleading military operations during Vietnam. The War Powers Act says the President, as Commander-in-Chief, can commit forces without Congress declaring war. But the President must report that commitment promptly to Congress. Involvement of troops must be limited to 60 or 90 days unless Congress extends the deadline. And Congress can end a commitment of troops by passing a resolution. With Bosnia, Senator Hutchison felt the War Powers Act was ineffective.
The War Powers Act is not working at all. At first, when the War Powers Act was put forward, there was a great concern that it would hamper a president's ability to act in an emergency. In fact, the opposite has happened. It's almost been like the president has a free run from 60 to 90 days and doesn't have to tell Congress anything. And in fact, that's about what President Clinton has done.
I believe our nation has already made the difference between war and peace there.
The disagreement over what the president can do in Bosnia is the same disagreement Congress and the executive branch historically have when it comes to the War Powers Act.
It's a message to the President of the United States, who is acting like a dictator. When is he going to get the message?
Presidents will almost always oppose the War Powers Act because, theoretically at least, they see it as impinging on the constitutional authority of the president as commander-in-chief. Congress, of course, would argue, well, presidents were impinging on the constitutional authority of Congress to be able to decide when and where we would get into hostilities through a declaration of war.
Although the Constitution gives Congress alone the authority to declare war, that official declaration has done little to hamper military operations. In fact, between 1950 and 1996, 9 American presidents committed United States troops to foreign soil without ever asking Congress to declare war. What is more common is that a president will ask Congress to pass a resolution supporting troop deployment, though when and how that occurs may differ. Consider, for example, how Presidents Bush and Clinton each addressed Congress when they took aim at Iraq. In 1990, after Iraq invaded Kuwait, Bush ordered more than 500,000 troops into the Persian Gulf, and after a brief war, forced Hussein to withdraw from Kuwait. In that case, President Bush notified Congress, and Congress gave permission to send soldiers to the Gulf to engage in combat. But in 1996, when President Clinton sent troops to Iraq, he did not notify Congress. Iraq had attacked Kurds living within its borders. The president ordered the use of cruise missiles to destroy strategic Iraqi targets. Some lawmakers claimed Clinton had violated the War Powers Act by not getting congressional permission to bomb.
We must not have the commitment of military power without even a word of consultation with the Congress.
But in the end, when tempers cooled, Congress passed a resolution supporting troops for Iraq.
In the end, once American troops are committed, which a president can do, to a situation where they might be endangered, and the Congress has to vote on whether to remove them, which could, in fact, increase the danger. The president's saying, we need support for our troops. Practically speaking, Congress is going to have to give that approval.
I do not believe we should limit the funds for food, supplies, and ammunition for our troops. It was wrong during Vietnam, and it's wrong now. We're talking about troops who have been committed. They're on their way. They're going to be there next week.
When it comes to United States military operations, it is important to project unity, for Congress and the President to speak with one voice and back the troops. Even if, as one scholar says, separation of power is an invitation to struggle.
No piece of legislation like the War Powers Act is going to change the fundamental reality that presidents and Congress will always struggle over who really has the authority.
We must work together. The people of this nation elected us all. They want us to be partners, not partisans. They put us all right here in the same boat. They gave us all oars, and they told us to row.
As a Democratic president with a Republican Congress, President Clinton's first term showcased dramatic standoffs between the executive branch and Congress and showed the impact of public opinion and the media. When Republicans demanded budget cuts the president wouldn't support, they closed government offices, not expecting a public backlash that would cost them elections. Weakened, the Republican Congress the following year lost their battle to pass a balanced budget amendment and found ways to compromise with the president. Though some lawmakers were also angered when President Clinton bombed Iraq without their permission, Congress eventually supported the action and stood behind the troops. Ours is a system rooted in checks and balances and on a sharing of power, the inherent struggle between the executive and legislative branches. But as President Clinton and the 105th Congress learned, it's the partnerships forged in that tension that move the country forward.
My fellow Americans, we have work to do. Let us seize those days and the century. Thank you, God bless you, and God bless America.